Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give folks a few more minutes to file in. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Amy Boyd. I'm senior attorney in Acadia Center's Boston office.
And I'm Mark LeBel, staff attorney here in Boston too.
And for those of you who aren't familiar with Acadia Center, we are a nonprofit research and advocacy organization committed to advancing the clean energy future. We approach efforts to build clean, low carbon, and consumer-friendly economies by using reliable information, comprehensive advocacy, and problem solving through innovation and collaboration. And today, we are gathered to talk about modernizing the energy grid in Massachusetts. We should be done by 3, and we're going to take questions and answers at the end. There's a little Q&A box at the top of your screen. So if things occur to you along the way, feel free to go ahead and type in the questions, and then we'll gather them at the end. So we're going to focus today on the what and why of grid modernization, Acadia Center's perspective on why grid modernization is particularly important, and focusing on Massachusetts, give an update on the grid mod cases and the Eversource rate case, which also touches on grid mod. And finally, our legislation that we are championing to address shortcomings of the DPU framework and utility filings. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mark to talk about our recent EB 2030 work and why grid mod is key to achieving the carbon reductions we need in the Northeast.
Here we go. Hi, everybody. So Energy Vision 2030 is a report that our analytical team put out a couple months ago that looks at defining a realistic pathway to meet our 2030 greenhouse gas emissions requirements for New England and New York. So the primary scenario has a 45% reduction target for 2030 from a 1990 baseline. But we also look at a 50% reduction scenario as well. And there's 4 categories of actions that we look at in the report: electricity generation, transportation, buildings, and then grid modernization. This next slide shows the sector by sector emissions results for the 2030 report. Electricity generation reduces from 53 million tons to 18 million tons. Transportation goes down from 138 to 106, and building goes from 101 to 73. The primary factors here are major switching of generation from fossil fuels to renewables, a significant electrification of transportation and heating, and continued expansion of energy efficiency, particularly outside of Massachusetts. Grid modernization isn't in the chart, but it's really what ties everything together. The grid literally ties all of this together, but the grid modernization is what makes this all work in conjunction. So why grid modernization? The new technologies that we have, both on the grid and for people's homes, and the increasing penetration of renewables, all lead to new needs and new opportunities. And the benefits of all this can include customer bill savings, system cost savings, reliability and resiliency, lower emissions of all kinds, and even avoiding disruptive infrastructure projects. So a couple years ago, Acadia Center put out a report called Utility Vision that was a high-level blueprint for grid modernization with a number of different elements. The first piece is comprehensive planning for a consumer-focused distribution grid, updated benefit calculations to reflect the public interest, including things like greenhouse gas emissions, robust stakeholder input and participation, particularly including consumer stakeholders, but also clean energy industry and environmental organizations, public interest organizations. We need to align utility incentives with consumer and environmental goals. We need to make progress towards time-varying rates and value-based net metering credit structures. And there needs to be an overlay of consumer protection and education. One other thing to mention is that benefit cost analysis and performance metrics that should be a part of changing utility incentives are important accountability measures so that the public and regulators can hold the utilities accountable for achieving the results that we want to see. So how do we actually get all of this done? There are different but related issues at both the state level and the regional level, and that are ultimately controlled by FERC. So that includes new types of investments, new market structures, new regulatory frameworks, and new utility business models. Today, we're primarily talking about what Massachusetts can do, which is a little narrower than the entire scope of grid modernization. The state's jurisdiction is over the distribution companies that operate here. That's Eversource, National Grid, and Unitil primarily. It's over retail rates for all distribution company customers, not just distribution rates, but transmission and energy supply as well. Massachusetts also controls siting within the state and has some additional leverage with contracting and incentive program criteria.
So, the heart of grid modernization in Massachusetts at this point comes from the Department of Public Utilities, DPU, and starts with 3 orders that came out in 2014 that had some pretty specific requirements. The 4 objectives that were set out in 1276B, for those of you who know the particular one, that the plans for grid modernization are designed to achieve are reducing the effects of outages, optimizing demand, integrating distributed resources, and improving workforce and asset management. So these are the gold standards by which everything will be measured and to which we are striving. To do this, the utilities are allowed to file a short-term investment plan with special cost recovery. One requirement of that was that there is a 5-year rollout of advanced metering functionality as default. And they are also allowed to use other incremental grid modernization capital investments and include them in the special cost recovery of the STIP, so long as the business case justifies this expenditure through a benefit cost analysis. The plans are also supposed to include utility-specific and statewide metrics for infrastructure and performance, and opt-out time-varying rates for basic service, the energy supply component of it. a marketing, education, and outreach plan so that consumers know about the grid modernization efforts, what to do with their new meters, and how to use the opt-out time varying rates. And a research and development and deployment plan so that we can continue modernizing the grid and using innovative technologies as they come forth. So what's missing from the Massachusetts orders? We think that the stakeholder process, although it's somewhat mentioned in the Massachusetts orders, needs to be a lot more robust and include a lot more of the sorts of organizations that Mark was mentioning, as well as significant changes to utility financial incentives to actually get after their bottom line and reward them for doing the sorts of improvements that we want them to do. As part of this, we need expanded benefit calculations to include benefits like greenhouse gas reductions and better consumer involvement. We also would have liked to have seen requirements to examine local clean alternatives to infrastructure projects, and relatedly, comprehensive distribution system planning reform. Plus, we still need, separate from what the DPU can give us in these orders, a planned docket on data privacy and cybersecurity, because the advanced metering functionality is going to deliver a huge amount of information. So we need to be thinking about how that information is protected, as well as statutory changes for value-based net metering reform to be able to compensate distributed resources for the value that they're actually giving the grid. So what happened in the grid modernization process? There was a lot of delay. The original filings in August 2015 were followed by 6 months without action. It then got suspended again after the legislative session of 2016 ended, and finally moved forward. There was a new procedural schedule issued in October 2016. We had intervener testimony in March 2017, hearings in May, and briefing in July, and just wrapping up now in August. The delays had significant consequences for both Eversource and National Grid. Their key projections for benefit cost analysis are over 2 years old, and there have been a fair amount of changes in those 2 years. And then for Eversource, the department allowed Eversource to bifurcate its case. So what that means is the original grid modernization plan that Eversource filed back in 2015 then got divided into the IGMP, which is still in the grid modernization dockets, which has medium advanced meters for about 5% of the basic service customers, lots of marketing, and some cybersecurity upgrades. And the grid modernization base commitment, which is now in the rate case, which has everything else, like upgrades to physical infrastructure of the system, communications, to enable the two-way power flow that comes from distributed renewables, as well as, the little star there, $100 million in energy storage pilots and $45 million in infrastructure to jumpstart EV development. We're mostly going to focus on the IMGP and GMBC minus those additional items. Although it's notable that Eversource is proposing as part of the rate case that they get paid for all of this, the IGMP and the GMBC, through a grid mod factor in their performance-based rate-making mechanism, another feature of the rate case, rather than using the STIP procedure that the department proposed. So, what did the utilities propose? National Grid put forth 4 scenarios, 2 of which included advanced metering rollout to everyone and followed most of the requirements of the orders. Also, a wide range of potentially beneficial investments, little light on distributed renewables integration measures, and we think they had an inadequate slate of performance metrics, which are the way that the department and stakeholders are going to be able to actually tell whether the objectives are being met. Eversource had no advanced metering rollout, inadequate, and in some cases no benefit cost analysis of what they were doing, a lack of detail for the grid mod base commitment, and infrastructure metrics only with very little performance tracking. So they're keeping up with how many gadgets they're putting into the field, but not actually what they're doing. So key questions that came out of the briefing process, which, as I mentioned, is still ongoing right now. National Grid interveners are mostly concerned about the details. Is the proposed plan ambitious enough? Is their benefit cost analysis still meaningful given the delay? Are the projected benefits and costs even plausible? National Grid is optimistic about how grid modernization and the advanced metering technology will affect the grid. And how plausible is that? Are the proposed performance metrics sufficient? We think no. Are additional low-income protections needed? And can costs be shared with New York and or Rhode Island, as those two states, in particular New York, are engaging in deployment of advanced metering themselves, and some back office costs might be able to be shared. For Eversource, we're pretty concerned about the fundamentals. What does it mean that advanced metering was not proposed? What does it mean that they failed to provide benefit cost analysis? And does the rate case proposal contain sufficient detail to approve? The funding mechanism, as I mentioned, the grid mod factor of the performance-based rate making mechanism, is also under dispute in the rate case. So our recommendations in particular, for National Grid, we suggest that the department order them to refile 2 of the 4 proposed scenarios in 2018. These are the 2 that involve full deployment of advanced metering infrastructure and come the closest to having a good benefit cost analysis, as well as updating the benefit cost analysis to take in the changes that have happened over the last 2 years and some of the savings, as well as a detailed assessment of the potential synergies with other jurisdictions, particularly New York. As I mentioned, the ability to possibly share back office costs. For Eversource, we propose that the department order them to file a new fully compliant plan in 2019, as well as refiling some investments in 2018 as interim programs. So these interim programs, we suggest, should be limited to categories of investments that are severable from the widespread rollout of AMF that we hope is coming in the 2019 proposal. Things like DER customer portal, 1 pilot storage project, and rollout of on a number of circuits in order to test and work on a few details. We also want them to deny the proposal to fund it through the performance-based rate-making mechanism. We're actually arguing in the Eversource rate case that the PBRM be denied entirely. And for both utilities, we want to see improved performance metrics, strengthened stakeholder processes, and a broader net of stakeholders involved, additional protections for low-income ratepayers, and offering opt-in time-of-use rates for energy supply as a transition measure so that people who want to be using time-of-use rates, for instance, be able to charge your electric vehicle at night, can do so, reduce some of the demand on the grid during peak demand periods, and help us all out. So what's next? The decision for Eversource rate case has to come by late 2017, by the end of 2017 actually, and there's no deadline for decisions in the grid mod dockets. Logically, because there is so much overlap, we would think that it would be coordinated with the Eversource rate case order, but there's actually no obligation. And then there's also relevant proposals pending at the legislature right now, including the Benson-Pacheco bill, which we're going to talk about a lot more today, though we'd like you to also keep your attention on storage bills, siting bills, energy efficiency, and electric vehicle bills, as they all affect grid modernization and a lot of these issues too.
Great. So as Amy just mentioned, we wanted to walk through and focus on the provisions in the Benson-Pacheco bill that we've worked on at the State House. And there's 4 primary components of that bill. It's not perfect and it doesn't cover everything, but we think that these would be major steps in the right direction. The 4 components are Grid Mod 2.0 plans, next steps after the current plans, alternatives to utility infrastructure, a cap on residential fixed charges, as well as offering opt-in time of use rates. So the first piece is a new process for grid mod plans. The bill would require conclusion of the current grid mod dockets by the end of this year, which could plausibly happen but is not guaranteed. It would require the DPU to start a new proceeding early in next year to work on a new framework, as well as performance metrics and other items that can be done next year. It would require new plans from the utilities by October of 2019, and it would create a new grid modernization consumer board. It's a lot like the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council that many of you should know. It would include the DOER, the Attorney General's Office, ratepayer, stakeholders, as well as representatives from the clean energy industry and environmental organizations. Much like the EEAC, it would review, comment on, and approve the grid mod plans and would have the power to hire consultants. On the substance of the grid mod plans, it's general in many ways, but it would require metrics and performance incentives for the distribution companies, protections for low-income consumers, and then grid modernization plans every 5 years from each utility. The plan would be required to include locational costs and benefits, hosting capacity maps, location-based incentives, and then pre-authorization of any necessary distribution infrastructure and other expenses, as well as identifying any additional barriers to the deployment of local energy resources. So the next major component of the bill is about alternatives to utility infrastructure. This is primarily electric infrastructure, not gas at this point. The bill would modify the authority of the Energy Facility Siting Board, which they already have, over transmission and distribution investments over $1 million. The EFSB already requires an analysis of alternatives. However, the bill would require independent third-party evaluation instead of the current evaluation that has to be done by the proposer of the infrastructure, who obviously has a conflict of interest. It would require a submission of an application 4 years prior to the in-service date. If the third-party evaluation finds that there are alternatives, then the bill would require solicitation and procurement of those resources. The Department of Energy Resources would be responsible for developing a benefit cost framework to determine the relative cost effectiveness of different alternatives. The next major component of the bill is a cap on residential fixed charges. Fixed charges are the monthly fee that customers pay regardless of the amount of electricity consumed. High fixed charges are bad for a wide number of reasons. Notably, they're bad for energy efficiency, distributed generation, and low-income ratepayers. Utilities across the country have pushed for higher fixed charges, in large part because they want a guaranteed revenue stream, but they also like some of the side effects of fixed charges as well. Eversource and National Grid have recently proposed higher fixed charges in Massachusetts, both in the current Eversource rate case, and National Grid proposed tiered customer charges in their last rate case. National Grid is also proposing to recover the cost of advanced metering through fixed charges in their grid modernization docket, something that we have argued against along with a number of other people. This provision would permanently cap residential fixed charges to remove the possibility of this dispute continuing to move forward, and would cap it with an economically based definition. This is very close to a law that we successfully got passed down in Connecticut 2 years ago. Then the last section of this bill requires the utilities to offer opt-in time of use rates for basic service customers. Unlike the current requirement for opt-out time varying rates, which would come at some point in the future, and which is proposed by National Grid, these would be simpler two-time period on-peak and off-peak time of use rates, which require much less costly metering. The bill also requires protection for consumers who opt in, a prohibition on switching in and out, but it would also end once we have opt-out or mandatory time varying rates, because the opt-in approach would no longer be needed. So that's an end to the substantive provisions in the bill, but the question is, what should we be working on next? On the legislative front at the legislature, Acadia Center has circulated to many people, and we'd be happy to circulate again a coalition one-pager, and we'd love more sign-ons to that coalition one-pager. It's also important to weigh in directly on the importance of these issues in the course of your other advocacy that you're doing at the legislature. And then there will be a hearing at the TUE committee. It's expected on November 14th for the Benson-Pacheco bill. And beyond the legislature, a number of other influential leaders would be helpful to get on board with all of this. EEA, DOER, and the governor's office are crucial, of course. The Attorney General's office has been fairly supportive in the dockets, but it would be great to make this a bigger priority for them as well. So that is the end of our presentation, and we'd be happy to open it up to questions and conversation.
We're also, there's our contact information if you have questions later on. Does anybody have any questions? Oh.
We need to figure out how to unmute people.
Yeah, really. Participants, okay. Viewers. Okay.
Oop, that's probably not right.
Okay. Felicia, you should be on.
Okay.
You want to ask your question?
Yeah, I had a few questions. I came in a little late, so I missed your beginning introduction. I got in like three after 2. But there are a few questions. One is that you're proposing that National Grid should refile 2 of their 4 proposals. I'm thinking that means that 2 of them are actually good, or are they just like the least bad in terms of good proposals?
So two of them are good, I think, is the short answer. 2 of their 4 proposals include a full rollout of advanced metering, and they have a benefit cost ratio, according to their analysis, very close to 1. So those are the 2 scenarios that we're recommending they move forward with. The other 2 scenarios are much less ambitious and don't have a full advanced metering rollout.
Okay. And then there are 2 other questions. One's a statement and one's a question. Yeah. Does carbon pricing have a place in any of this? It seems like an important piece of the picture. It's not being addressed here. Or is it just a separate campaign and doesn't belong in this explanation?
So, I mean, everything's related. So the more that you have a carbon price on transportation and heating, the more things will be pushed to electric sources, like cleaner electric sources like EVs and heat pumps. So there's one tie-in. RGGI, of course, RGGI strengthening will impact energy prices at the wholesale level. So there's all sorts of tie-ins. This is not our only legislative priority, and don't mean to suggest that that's the only thing that matters, of course. So you need to make sure it all works together, which is,
Right.
but that we didn't focus on the many other pieces that we care about deeply in this presentation.
But you think it could work together really well because it will boost the energy being used, electricity, and this is about the electric grid.
Yeah, I mean, we strongly support the need for higher RPS, carbon pricing, more work on energy efficiency. So we don't view those as exclusive, and it should all work together.
And the last thing is more of a statement. And again, like, I'm not sure what the overall subject here is, so I may be just bringing things that are totally off topic. It's that, like, in your initial goals, there isn't anything about like a social justice piece, like making sure that as much energy is sourced locally as possible, and that people are locally hired to do the work, and that, you know, sometimes people in the more neediest neighborhoods get focused on first. That's not in the component of any of this. Although it looks like in Pacheco's bill, he's looking at low-income customers, but.
Yeah, so the low-income customer certainly is a piece of it. For instance, defining the fixed cost would definitely have impact on low-income consumers because those fixed costs really affect them. They tend to be low users as well, so actually run into the issue of their that fixed charge actually setting a minimum bill for them regardless of how much they're using. And in terms of local resources, the local energy resources alternatives piece of it, while it's pretty wonky stuff at the EFSB, would, we hope, when effectively implemented, be able to substitute things like local microgrids even, and development of distributed renewables in communities rather than, you know, running a big transmission line through that community or something.
Right. Hopefully, you know, yes. I think you probably need more than hope, but it sounds like, again, it would be another whatever movement, another way. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. I can be taken.
So we're gonna move on to.
So I got a question texted to me from Mark Sandine, which I'm happy to answer. How would community choice towns be affected by the bill? The bill does specify that opt-in rates would be available to basic service customers, and it wouldn't specifically apply to people on competitive supply or aggregations. That's not something an exclusion we did deliberately when we drafted the bill and could possibly be addressed. The question there is the metering, because the average customer right now doesn't have the metering necessary to do time of use rates, and it would need to be installed by the utility because these are all utility meters. So there is a little bit of an issue there, but you could address that. It's interesting to know that there is something of a dispute in the grid mod dockets about the relevance of aggregation customers. The Attorney General was quite concerned, their office rather, was quite concerned that aggregation customers would no longer participate in opt-out time varying rates and would lower the benefits of the advanced metering. National Grid argued, I think, somewhat persuasively, that those customers could also use the new metering and have time varying rates, and that National Grid suggested they could work with community choice towns to offer time varying rates. So there are a bunch of different community choice issues, both in the bill and in grid modernization generally.
So we've received a couple questions about whether the presentation will be available online and elsewhere for sharing or for reference. We're definitely going to put the presentation online, and we are trying to record the webinar So hopefully we can make it available online as well. Okay, Mark, do you want to take this one on
From Bill?
Governor Baker or from Bill?
Well, let's do Governor Baker first.
Okay.
So I'm not aware if Governor Baker has specifically weighed in here. Obviously, the Department of Public Utilities has not made this a priority over the last 3 years, which is disappointing. DOER has been pretty good. So it's, on the whole, though, the EEA and the administration has not made this a priority. I do think they're going to be forced to wrestle with this, particularly because they have to make a decision in the Eversource rate case. And if they don't, then they will rightly be accused of ignoring a major issue that other states are dealing with. So I would expect them to need to come up with a real position on this that I would hope is not don't do it. But we've yet to see where they come out, frankly. Bill Ravanisi next.
Sure.
So yeah, the public health aspects of all of this.
See his question, or should we read it?
It's in the chat so people can see it. It
Okay.
says all panelists so people can see it.
Okay.
But the general thrust of the question is about the cost shifting through public health harms. That, you know, to the extent that we aren't doing this and aren't cleaning up our pollution issues, we're really shifting costs to the healthcare sector that show up in insurance premiums or all sorts of other areas. So the one way to do this correctly is that talked about expanded benefit calculations, and public health should definitely be a part of that. So, you know, greenhouse gas emissions are one thing we emphasize, but we believe public health requirements certainly should be on that list of expanded benefits as well.
Okay. And then we had a question about who's part of our coalition.
So some initial signers of the coalition one-pager are Clean Water Action, CLF, Mass Solar, ELM, AMC, STEM, E for the Future, Northeast Energy Efficiency Council, Embarrack, and Toxic Action Center. I believe I talked to some colleagues of yours at UCS about this at one point, but it'd be great if you guys wanted to join. Or maybe I'm forgetting who, maybe I'm misremembering the name.
Paula says, please add us. Please add us. Great.
Great.
Oh, Haskell had a question about where's the speaker and all this.
Well, the speaker certainly has not had to weigh in on all of this. And frankly, I doubt it will get up to his level until after the hearing. So it'll be important to get the word to legislators and get the word to the Energy Committee that this is something that the House needs to deal with, and the speaker, you know, don't see any reason why he shouldn't be open to this. We're already doing so many things on solar and electric vehicles and storage. Grid modernization is really what makes all of those things work, and how you actually benefit ratepayers with all of the other things that we are already doing. All right. Lana from League of Women Voters asks about, is this subject to regional federal control, or are we truly free as a state to make these changes? So for all the state issues that we've talked about today, particularly the things in the bill, Massachusetts is free to do those. Other items that we'd like to see that fall under grid modernization are more controlled by ISO New England and or FERC. Massachusetts can be influential in that debate, but doesn't control it. Obviously, we may not have friends at FERC right now. Claire Chang asked, what can grassroots groups do to help? Just like with any other issue, we try to simplify some of our messages for grassroots folks because this is a complicated topic. But just like with anything else, have average citizens reach out to their legislators to demonstrate that they know about this and think it's important. So I don't think there's anything unusual about that. This is a little more complicated than some of the topics we ask grassroots folks to weigh in on, but we work hard to try to get a message that works for grassroots and make that advocacy effective.
And we have some materials on our website, a 2-page summary of the bill, as well as the 1-page that we have been discussing, and some background on local energy resource alternatives in general. Those are on acadiacenter.org, or we can also send them around to everybody.
Great. Yeah, we'll send around the coalition 1-pager to everybody for sign-ons to everyone who attended this webinar after we're done today. Thank you for all the interest. Joel Wool asks, do we have thoughts where other states or countries are going on grid mod? Yeah, so the leading states, well, Massachusetts was a leading state a few years ago, but is no longer due to all of the delays. California is, frankly, the leader on this, and New York is trying to catch up with them on many of these issues. On individual issues, there are different states that are models. You know, Connecticut actually has decent time of use rates. You know, Rhode Island and Maine have some non-wires alternatives. New York is still the leader in that area, though. And then even New Hampshire has adopted a good order recently on moving towards value-based net metering credits. So there are, on the big picture stuff, New York and California are definitely the leaders. On individual issues, there are other states who have instructive examples as well.
So Mary asks, what is the impact on municipal light plans? Munis are not part of the DPU jurisdiction, so none of the orders and plans that we just discussed would apply to them. Though I'm sure they're also facing these same issues about when and how to upgrade the infrastructure and allow you know, better integration and better two-way power flows.
What is the number of the Benson-Pacheco bill? It's H 1725 on the House side and S 1875 on the Senate side, and that's in the 1-pager that will circulate. So we will send that around to everybody as well. Will we share these slides? Yes, we're happy to share the slides too, along with the 1-pager for folks.
Yes. So we're going to follow up with an email to everybody who attended today's conference with the coalition letter and with the slides, as well as updating our website once we have additional sign-ons, and hopefully being able to post the video of this webinar as well.
All right, any other questions? We don't need to keep people any longer than we need to. I think it's been a pretty good session. Thank you everyone so much for attending.
Thanks. And you have our contact information if you have any more questions or want to follow up. Thanks very much.